This week on Just Solutions, remembering the Wilmington Massacre, the only coup d'etat ever to take place on American soil, happened on November 10th, 1898 in North Carolina. It began with the torching of a black-owned newspaper in Wilmington, and it ended with white supremacists overthrowing the local government. The story is documented in the film Wilmington on Fire. Today, the director and producer of that documentary, Chris Everett, and historian and author LeRae Umfleet join us to talk about the coup and its legacy. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Chris and LeRae, it's great to have you with us, and we are so excited here at Free Speech TV to be premiering Wilmington on Fire next week. We're going to have lots of opportunities for our viewers to see this really incredible documentary that's so relevant today, particularly as states like North Carolina are trying to pass bills that essentially stop discussions about race and white privilege in the schools. We need to have conversations about history, and we're going to be talking about the film, what happened, the research into this, and the legacy of 1898. But first, we want our viewers to get a chance to see what the documentary is all about.
They say the Cape Fear River was full of bloody black bodies that day, that black people couldn't find their way, that black men died from gunshots in their backs, that black women ran to the swamps across the tracks, that very smart and bold black men were put on the train and given a free ride out of town where they were told to remain. They say that the dead bodies were left in the streets. The foul smell was so strong that buzzards circled for weeks, that black babies cried and moaned for their fathers and a bite to eat, that black folks lost all their savings and were left helpless and beat. It had to be done, said the white people who started it. They loved their town until the blacks tried to change it. They took over the city to restore their heritage, they said. They were heroes to many who wanted uppity folks dead. Some folks still don't see anything wrong with what they did, or that any harm was done to the ones who ran and hid. Serious damage was done to the soul of the town. That's why folks want to turn it around. Now is the time to make up for the crime, to help our children learn from our mistake, to ensure that there will be no more 1898.
That's the trailer for the documentary Wilmington on Fire. We are premiering it next week, next Thursday, here on Free Speech TV, and we're so excited to do that. Chris, you're the filmmaker behind this. You grew up in North Carolina. What inspired you? Why did you want to make a documentary about this?
Well, what inspired me is that I guess just my love for Black history, Black culture. I've always been fascinated with our history and culture, especially history that's not talked about in the mainstream. And so what really drew me into this story was that it wasn't being talked about like that in mass media. There were several books written about it over the years. LeRae wrote a great book about it and did a great report about it. But, no one actually did a film, and put that visual behind it. So I decided, I want to take the task to do it. And that's what we did. It took a few years to do it, but we put it together. And so growing up in North Carolina, especially through the North Carolina school system, we never heard anything about this history. It wasn't until later on, until I, went to college and then moved to Atlanta, is when I first kind of start hearing about it. And it just blew my mind away that we never learned about this history in North Carolina coming up through the school system, or not even really in college like that either. And so I said, you know what, since I want to do documentaries and get more involved in film, let me take the initiative and try to put a film project together.
Well, LeRae, you're an historian. You're an author as well. That book that Chris referenced, A Day of Blood, also delves into what happened in 1898. But many of our viewers won't know about this because, as Chris mentioned, it is not being taught in schools. not just in North Carolina, but really anywhere. As an historian, take us back to 1898, because Wilmington was a unique place because it was what the New South could have become after the Civil War. That's a quote from you, LeRae, from the documentary. Why was Wilmington so unique, particularly in terms of race, back in 1898?
Thank you for having me. North Carolina was a hybrid in the way that African Americans and whites were finding this new path together forward after the Civil War and Reconstruction. Wilmington was our largest city, and it was, as I said, what we could have become had we continued on a path through to the 20th century. Because in Wilmington, African Americans were becoming entrepreneurs, professionals. More people who lived in Wilmington who were African American owned homes in Wilmington than anywhere else in North Carolina. Education levels were higher for Wilmingtonians, and there was more entrepreneurship in Wilmington in the African American community than other places in North Carolina. And everyone was succeeding in the city, regardless of their status in the 1860s, whether they were poor whites, African Americans, enslaved, free. Everyone was making it in Wilmington. That's not to say it was a utopia by any stretch of the imagination, but it was what we should be striving for as we move into the 20th century. So African Americans at the turn of the century in 1898 were seated on the Board of Aldermen, which was the city government for the city of Wilmington. The highest paid position in the city, that was a federal position appointed by President McKinley, was appointed to a Black man who was the collector of customs for the Port of Wilmington. And that's one of the reasons Wilmington was so large and so important, is because it was a major port for the state and even the Southeast in the way that the port was developed, and also the way the trains came into the city. Boats would come in, offload materials and supplies, and send those throughout the South. And other items would come into Wilmington and go on the boats to go anywhere else in the world. So that's a quick snapshot of what Wilmington was. We had Alex Manley, an African American newspaper editor who was printing a daily African American paper. And he had customers from both the white and Black communities, ads from the white and Black communities. Black businesses were in the main central business district with both white and Black customers. So this really was a metropolis where everyone could succeed if they had the desire to make a change.
And just to expand on what you're saying there, it was thriving economically. It was a Black majority town. I believe, was it 55, 56% of the population were African American, but they also had political influence. You said there about the aldermen, but there was also a very interesting political reality happening in terms of fusion politics, where you had members of the Republican Party, white members, who were merging with populists and African Americans as well. Take us through what was happening politically regarding fusion politics.
So if I use the word Republican or Democrat in 1898, first thing we have to understand is that Republicans and Democrats of 1898 are not Republicans and Democrats of the 21st century. Democratic Party supporters and leadership were super conservative. They were very often members of the veterans groups who were Civil War veterans in the Confederacy, and rural farmers. Then we have the Republican Party, which is the party of African American voters and progressive white businessmen. And in the center, we have this third party, the Populist Party. And the Populist Party is predominantly white people who were disaffected with the Democratic Party. They stepped away from the Democratic Party and created the Populist Party. And both the Populist Party and the Republican Party had voting minorities in the total scope of the state of North Carolina at the time. And they came up with this idea called fusion, where they would merge the populist vote and the Republican vote. And together that merged voting power would outnumber the Democratic Party votes across the state. So in 1896, fusion was the first successful thing that had happened since Reconstruction to put Republicans in leadership positions in North Carolina, including our governor, who was a Republican governor. And we had fusionist type politicians in city governments across the state and in the state legislature. And the overall effect was to make government in North Carolina more egalitarian and more accessible for everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic or racial status. And the Democratic Party, beginning in 1898, decided that they wanted to do everything they could to break apart fusion, and the white supremacy platform was the tool that they selected to do that, to pull those white disaffected Democrats away from fusion and put them back into the Democratic Party fold as voters based on the white supremacy concepts.
And there was, in fact, a white declaration of independence that was made. I want to talk about the events that led up to the ultimate coup and the massacre. There was a few different things going on, and there are so many parallels to what we've seen recently politically as well. But LeRae, you mentioned there the Alex Manly, the owner of the black newspaper in town that was very successful. Chris, you spoke to one of his descendants about that. So take us through that, because this might be relegated to history or not even history books, because as we've heard, it's not always being taught. Right. But there are direct descendants right now who are living through the aftermath and the legacy, the ripple effect of what happened. And we'll dig into that in a moment. But take us through the descendants that you spoke to in Wilmington on Fire, particularly the descendants of that owner of that black newspaper.
Yeah, well, we had the pleasure of filming Dr. Lewin Manly. He's the grandson of Alexander Manly, who you guys spoke about, the owner of the Daily Record, which was the black-owned newspaper in Wilmington during this time, right before the 1898 massacre. And also, with Dr. Manly was fascinating and striking. When we filmed him and a few other descendants, a lot of them really didn't even find out about this event until later on in life. It was a thing that was kind of kept from them growing up. He knew that his grandfather had a newspaper in Wilmington, but he didn't really know why they actually left. He just thought that they just moved and just wanted to do something else, move to Philadelphia and do something else. But it wasn't later on until he saw his grandfather mentioned in a book and talking about the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. And then he started talking to his relatives. I think two of his aunts, who were actually little girls at the time during the 1898 massacre, he went to them and they were still living in Wilmington, and he talked to them about it. And then they finally opened up and told him what happened about the 1898 massacre, why his grandparents had to leave town as well. And so he has just been, entrenched in this ever since he found out this history about his grandfather and the rest of his relatives. And we also had the pleasure of interviewing Miss Faye Chaplin. She was the great granddaughter of one of the wealthiest African-American men in Wilmington prior to the 1898 massacre, Thomas C. Miller. And Thomas C. Miller was a real estate guy, owned a lot of property throughout the city of Wilmington. He also owned one of the only pawn shops in town as well. And he loaned money to white and black folks throughout the city of Wilmington. He was banished during the whole banishment campaign during the 1898 massacre. And same with her. She didn't really find out a lot of this stuff until later on in life. And so that's some of the things we kind of ran across filming quite a few of the some of these direct descendants, is that a lot of them sort of kind of knew what happened, but they didn't know the depths of it and the links that what this whole thing was about. And so sitting down with them for hours and hours, documenting them and talking with them and hearing those intimate stories of, especially with Dr. Manly, of him talking about how his grandparents actually met and those type of things. And when his grandfather finally came to Wilmington and his occupation at the time, he was doing like commercial painting. Then he got into the newspaper industry and how he met his grandmother and things like that. And, doing, Sunday school at Chestnut Presbyterian Church. And, so hearing those intimate stories that were passed down through his family were really captivating and really caught my eye as well.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching us. Are you in North Carolina? Are you somewhere where you've heard of this history, or is this news to you as well? As we're hearing, it's not something that has been widely taught. Well, I mentioned in the intro that it started with the torching of the black-owned newspaper. We talked there about Alex Manly, but really it began prior to that. This was very well organized. And as we said, it was a white supremacist group on a very explicitly white supremacist platform that had started to target Blacks in the community. One of the key points was torching the Black-owned newspaper. And then, of course, there was a rival white-owned newspaper in Wilmington. But there were a couple of different things I want to dig into, because we were talking about the coup and the banishment. There was a state election in 1898, not necessarily in Wilmington, but this was a crucial point that led to the coup in the municipal government in Wilmington. LeRae, take us back to what was happening in the elections in 1898, that November, and how that led to the coup and the subsequent massacre in Wilmington.
So again, the Democratic Party wanted to regain control of not just Wilmington, but the state of North Carolina. And they had a long-range plan. The first part of that plan was to regain control of the state legislature in 1898. And then the second part would be the 1900 election to regain control of the governor's office. And so in 1898, the effort was statewide to break apart Fusion and bring Republican people to under control in their version of things, so that they would be intimidated to not even register to vote. African American men were told they would be fired if they registered, and if they voted, they would be fired also. And so that election, because of all the oppressive tactics that the Democratic Party used over the course of the election campaign season of 1898, beginning heavily in the summer of 1898 and culminating on November 8th when they won the election. They used a combination of newspapers with lots of propaganda and political cartoons. They used speakers who traveled around giving fiery speeches about white supremacy and all the things that needed to be done to keep African American men under control. And then they used terroristic arm of the Democratic Party, which were called the Red Shirts. And these were men who rode into African American communities and harassed Republican voters, regardless of race, and prevented them from going to the polls to vote. That three-pronged approach was very, very successful. The Democrats won every position that they had a nominated candidate for. However, in Wilmington, the mayor and board of aldermen was a Republican-led board of aldermen with Black members on the board. And those men in Wilmington and New Hanover County that had worked so very hard to win the state for the Democratic Party did not want to live any longer under Negro domination, which was one of the phrases that they used. And so this White Declaration of Independence that we spoke about was one where they said, we, the citizens of New Hanover, will no longer be led by men of African origin. And they demanded that Alex Manly stop printing his paper, that they fire Blacks at every opportunity and hire whites, and that the mayor and board of aldermen need to resign, and that economic opportunities need to be given to white men. And through the process of this all, we have the day of the violence on November 10th that starts out with the burning of Alex Manly's printing press. And many times the threat of violence that was used throughout the campaign built this stressful place up in Wilmington. And the men, white and Black, in the city were in this very tense, stressful place. And it just boiled over into uncontrolled violence on the day of the 10th. That is not to give anyone absolution for what happened. That's just a point to try to understand how people can lose control of a situation very quickly and very easily when you use the threat of violence that overflows into real violence. And so the fire happened in the morning of November 10th at the printing press. That afternoon, the mayor and board of aldermen were forced to resign under duress, which is a coup. There were about 200 armed men inside City Hall at that time, and the way the city charter was written is that if a member of the board of aldermen resigned, another member would be elected by the existing board to fill the vacancy. And so one by one, we see a quick change in control of the city of Wilmington from one that was legally elected to one that was appointed by the Democratic Party and the white supremacist platform. And throughout the afternoon of November 10th, we have mass murder in the streets, untold numbers of African American men killed, people fleeing the city for their safety, some never returned. And that's that story of the refugees that Chris's Blood is talking about, with people who don't even really understand what ancestors saw and felt.
And it wasn't just people fleeing, people were banished. You used that term, banishment, Chris. There was a list that was compiled and people were told, you have to leave and never return. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but just to expand on the legacy politically of that coup, because that's what it was. It was a coup on the municipal government in Wilmington. There was never, it took decades for African Americans to have political capital in Wilmington. Was it 1970s was when we saw political representation at a local level, and even in the 1990s at a congressional level, because at that time there was an African American congressional representative from North Carolina, but that was the last one until the 1990s. This had massive political repercussions as well as completely cutting the legs out from under the fusion politics as well.
Yeah, definitely. And not only did it do that, it really stunted the growth of what Wilmington could have been. Like, LeRae was saying earlier, Wilmington was North Carolina's largest city at the time. And then when this massacre happens, and then you have all these things take place within that city, especially, it just stunted the growth. The African-American population was literally cut down, over half. And then you see the lasting effects of that today, where Wilmington, the African-American population in Wilmington today is about 19%. The white population is around 76%. And you see all those lasting things where you don't have the plethora of Black-owned businesses, but we're starting to see a little bit more of that coming up. But for a long time, you didn't really see a lot of that. African Americans involved in the political arena here, the social arena, and also the business arena as well. So you see those lasting effects that have happened in Wilmington, and also just the potential of the city, where it could have been what we see Charlotte is right now, of being a major hub for commerce, the growth of it and everything. So to me, not only did it really affect African Americans throughout Wilmington, but also just affected Wilmington as a whole for not really being able to reach its truest potential.
Well, John, who's watching from Colorado, says it's not a coincidence that the Black press was one of the first targets, not unlike the recent Israeli destruction of the media building and tower in Gaza. It's a strategy that's often repeated in so many military offenses. Chris, you mentioned there the legacy of what we're seeing in Wilmington today. The population never recovered of African Americans. But if you think about the wealth, and we've talked about this in various different Just Solutions shows, about how wealth is transferred through generations, and the wealth building capacity of families has enormous consequences for people these days. When you look at the wealth that was amongst the African American community at that time, that was stolen from them, but many people who fled, the city, sold their property, or for maybe not the money that it was worth, or entire estates were divided up, and so that wealth generational impact is enormous as well. Was there ever a capacity to calculate in a dollar amount the impact on the descendants of those people who were impacted by the massacre?
No, that's really never been a true calculation. I know Professor Sandy Darity, who has an excellent book out right now about reparations. He actually, I think he worked on the economic impact for the state report that LeRae did for the state of North Carolina, and what they pretty much did was just, talked about and listed a lot of the Black businesses that were no longer there after the 1898 massacre, and just kind of just show that type of impact, that economic impact, but there really hasn't been a true dollar amount of what was lost, land, homes, businesses, etc. I don't even think you really can put a real price on it, and I don't think no one has really wanted to take that task of doing that as well. So we don't know. We know that not only just in Wilmington, but just that whole period of Jim Crow segregation throughout the South, affected African Americans across the board, because of all the discriminatory practices that were going on through whether it was, getting employment, getting capital, accessing capital to start or grow a business, home ownership, all of those things. And those things have an effect on, the African American community to this day. But to go back to your question, there really hasn't been a true dollar amount attached to this.
In terms of how it is or is not being commemorated, I know on the centenary anniversary that there was an effort to talk about this, but that itself proved divisive, with many people in the white community saying, this is history, we should move on. And many others saying, absolutely not. How can we move on if we don't have full accountability? So to that end, when it's not being fully addressed, either economically in terms of reparations or compensation, and I'll ask both of you this, what do you think justice might look like for Wilmington and for the direct descendants, but then also in acknowledgement of the ripple effect into the broader African American community of what happened in 1898? What might justice even look like?
I'll start and let Chris pick up, because from my perspective as the historian, I spent 3 years researching and writing what happened and why it happened, because we knew what the white perpetrators bragged about. We knew their story. I wanted to find out what the impact was on the African American community, those who were displaced or those who were affected. And we did do our best with Sandy to try to figure out what that economic dollar sign looked like. And it's exceptionally difficult to do that. But I think if someone does spend some more time, I always encourage people to continue to research this, because we can always learn something new. Maybe we'll get a better idea of that as we grow through learning about more descendants. But for me as a historian, this is an untold history, and a victory of some sort, a sharing of the history of the truths of 1898 is very important, and getting an understanding of the impact of 1898, not just on Wilmington in 1899, but to understand that this ushered in Jim Crow for North Carolina well into the 20th century, even you could argue into the 21st century. So understanding this foundational base of what created systemic racism in North Carolina and Wilmington is important. And as the historian who's tried to bring this out for understanding, that's important to me.
Well, Chris, just in the last minute, what are your thoughts on that? And also, given that you are doing an update, a second part essentially of Wilmington on Fire, to look at what's happening in modern day times, what do you think justice might look like?
I would say, I think number one, I think reparations are definitely owed. To what that looks like, I don't know. But like I said earlier, Professor Darity has an excellent book on ways to address that in different ways and strategies and points to bring some of that type of closure to come. But I think that's one way, and I think Wilmington really has to, I guess, come to terms of what happened. And I think they have over the years. And that's one of the things why we wanted to do a follow-up. Wilmington on Fire Chapter 2 is showing the community and them coming together, trying to recapture that fusion movement. And you have some great things going on in Wilmington right now that a lot of people don't even know about. It's like only time you hear about Wilmington is when January 6th happened, because people want to, talk about 1898, but people aren't talking about, Wilmington today and the community's efforts of really trying to bring the city whole again. And that's why we wanted to do a follow-up, to show that and highlight that the importance of it. I think people really need to see it, but also, I guess some of the business community as well, coming to terms. And we've seen that too, where a lot of the corporations and major businesses throughout the city of Wilmington saying, you know what, we have to do our part as well. And these are some of the things I wanted to accomplish with the film. And it's been going on because a lot of these companies are now showing the film doing trainings with their companies and the people who work in the companies to talk about this history and to be more involved in the community. So some of the major corporations and companies in Wilmington are starting to do this. And it's, because of the work we've been doing, me, LeRae, and others, with the books, with the film and everything. It's just been a real grassroots movement to bring this stuff along. And it's going to continue. It's going to have to continue to be like that, just a grassroots movement for this change. But I see change coming, but it's going to take a while to get there, but we'll see it.
Well, one of the major components of that is telling the history, and people can find out a lot more of this by watching the documentary Wilmington on Fire. And we are just delighted to be premiering that on Free Speech TV next week, next Thursday, May 27th. There'll be a lot of opportunities for viewers to engage with this. And in fact, next week on Just Solutions, we're going to continue our discussion about what's happening in Wilmington, the legacy of the coup and the massacre, and the parallels with what's happening today. So that's next week on Just Solutions. In the meantime, I would like to thank LeRae and Chris. Thank you so much for being with us. And we do encourage you to check out the documentary Wilmington on Fire, premiering next week on Free Speech TV. And join us next Wednesday for further conversation from Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.